Let us all please welcome Andy Fawkes, an independent consultant for training and simulation, and his topic is a military training perspective, technology, and trends. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Thanks, Rico. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much. This is quite challenging straight after lunch. So hopefully it will keep you interested. I listened to the earlier talks, of course, and excellent talks, and I've got some videos. I've just been told they're really important, so I've put some in. I'm also grateful to be here because I think from what we saw this morning, artificial intelligence may take over presenters' jobs, and I'm also grateful that you haven't looked at Glassdoor and thought you'd had something better to do than be here. So thank you for staying. I've got 45 or so minutes. I seem to be reverberating quite badly. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
My first slide will be coming up very soon, hopefully. Oh, I'm in charge, aren't I? Sorry. Okay, so my talk is military training perspective, technology and trends, and I want to thank the organisers for inviting me to talk about this subject. I'm not saying we do anything better or worse in the military training side, but this is just hopefully a different perspective and particularly how technology is used. Also, the picture there is, a picture paints 1,000 words. It's trying to communicate that the environment the military are in is land, sea and air, cyber, and maybe what you don't see is maybe a submarine out there and a military communication satellite. So obviously it isn't all offshore and it isn't all maritime. I'm going to be talking about land and air as well. Okay, this isn't a sales pitch, but I just wanted to give you this is the lens I look through, my perspective. So I was a long time in the Ministry of Defence, so very much on the customer side of training systems, and in NATO as well, so saw what a lot of nations were doing. But more recently I've already Uberized myself, so I work for a number of different companies. I suppose the main one is Bohemia Interactive Simulations. We've taken gaming technology and turned it into training software for the military, and I'll show that later. But also, I did spend a week once with the Society of Petroleum Engineers, so I know a little knowledge is dangerous, but hopefully you're not competing with them or anything. But that was a very interesting week, so I've met a number of your work colleagues in that sense. And also, I do talks, which is very interesting, so I go around and listen to what other people have to say rather than myself. So that's just the lens I'm looking through. I know there's some ex-military in this audience, so I'm not trying to pretend I know everything, but this is my perspective. Okay, so this is what I'm going to cover. It's straight after lunch, so I'll get the statistics out the way, okay? And then we'll talk a bit about the basics of training, the sort of context of military training. And then I've heard about the videos, so we'll put some videos in. Well, I just want to talk about sort of old generation, old thinking. So I just want to show you actually the sort of journey that the military have been on in terms of training, and then give you some examples of what the military do. I'm afraid a lot of it's a bit Anglo-based, US and UK, but it's more likely to find it on the internet. And then last but not least, I'm going to talk about training challenges and opportunities, and some of that already chimes with what you've heard this morning. So it's all seamlessly and effortless going from presentation to presentation for you. Okay, so I'll just get this out of the way, but actually, please listen. It's just to put the context of the military is not really an industry, but it just gives you some context. So the total world expenditure is $1.7 trillion. That's a lot of money. And you can see the biggest spenders there on the right. This is based on recent research from Sweden. But perhaps there's no laser here, unfortunately, but reassuringly, it does seem to have leveled off fairly recently. Well, reassuring depends if you're military industry or taxpayer. But just to give you a feel, and this will vary from nation to nation, but when I was in the UK Ministry of Defence, we tried to look at this, but the total cost of training and education in militaries was around 20%. A big driver of that is manpower, the people you need to train other people. the kit that you might have to buy extra aircraft and tanks, etc., to support training, etc. So it's big bucks. A lot of that is internal funding, of course. In terms of numbers of people, again, you know, these statistics are difficult to say that's categorical, but it's around 57 million if you look at active and reserve. And there you can see the sizes of the military. And perhaps I was amazed by, if you start adding reserves, you get that picture down the bottom. But it is also important to recognise that in terms of, it's probably different from the oil and gas, you're trying to train people doing it in the service all the time, but you also need to train people who maybe only can do a few weeks of training a year. This is a UK. I mean, decreasing numbers isn't always a bad thing. It may just reflect we've had more automation. So, for example, warships tend to have far less people in than they used to be when they were steam-powered. So declining numbers isn't always a bad thing, although certainly I'm sure the army would say you always need boots on the ground. But this just gives you a feeling, and certainly after the Cold War in the UK, numbers went down. But if you look at the figures on the right-hand side, you know, these are still large numbers of people you have to train every year. So big numbers, and that's the intake every year. So it's a continuous sausage machine, and that's just the UK. Obviously, this is about millennials, and this is amazing figures that 91% in the military in the US will be 40 or younger. And I think that was something I got from this morning, is that maybe we shouldn't just be thinking about the people joining. We should be thinking about, what about the trainers? You know, soon the millennials will be trainers, not, you know, very soon. And maybe they want to teach and instruct in different ways. So quite striking numbers in the military, and I know that's just the US, but not every military gives their figures. Another thing that hasn't been talked about, I think, is the male-female balance. I doubt whether this is bad, but certainly this is just the US example. I know it's sort of typical in the UK. So it's not just age, it's also gender, and maybe that's also something that needs to be addressed if you want to recruit more people. Although I don't know what the proportion is here, but I think that's another huge factor, especially in engineering. Coming to the end of the statistics, so don't worry. I think also it's worth remembering that in the military, officers in particular, this is the US, tend to be very well educated to start with. So maybe thinking about who's joining, maybe that affects your strategies towards learning. And then my final chart of the statistics is that, although it may seem for the media that the US military across everywhere in the world, actually, maybe this is different from oil and gas, offshore oil and gas, that most people are actually in their home country or home base. So there may be a difference there. I suspect most militaries are the same, that most of their militaries will be in their home base or their home country. Okay, so if you haven't fallen asleep, that's brilliant. We'll carry on now. Thank you. So let's just give you a bit of perspective. So let's talk about some of the basics. And I'll repeat this point. I can't possibly know what it is for every nation in the world, but I'm just giving you, from my experience and some statistics out there, what the general trends are. It's also, in terms of, again, military isn't an industry, but I guess if this was an industrial strategy, this is what the context is. Ideas of a lot of change, balance, where there's a technology being driven, is it civil, is it military, predictable and unpredictable threats. And also, I mean, you certainly fly across the world. The world is so congested, isn't it? It's full of people. The world has changed from the old days. Well, hopefully it has. You're not going to have major armies probably battling each other, sweeping across the plains. Another, perhaps, difference is that war is essentially a chaotic system. You never know really what's going to happen because your enemy is making decisions that you don't know about. So this is a well-used phrase, that no battle plan withstands contact with the enemy. So you need to train people to be flexibly minded because you don't know exactly what's going to happen. And this kind of creeps into training, that all but war is simulation. Nothing is going to prepare you for the actual reality, but you've got to try and get as close as you can. And train as you fight is a phrase that's used, so, or even fight as you train. The idea that you know exactly what you've got to do in terms of operating the kit and working with your colleagues, but you've got to be adaptable. And I heard this year from the Royal Navy when I was in the UK to capture this is, are we ready to fight tonight? So we know, exactly what we're doing, got to get on with it. And are we prepared to fight tomorrow? So the idea is you build people who are adaptable, whether they're officers or any rank, they can change depending on what you need. And also that you encourage people to think outside the box and be innovative and all those good things. So there is that tension between being kind of military, almost robotic, but also being flexible. And I've made this point, and I'll make it here again, is that nations do train differently. And I've gone to a number of conferences to do with people to train. It's all about training fast jet pilots. So these are the people who fly, the very fast jets, obviously. They're incredibly expensive people. They cost between £6 and £10 million to train each pilot. But each nation does it differently, and even when they fly the same aircraft, which I find totally fascinating point. So, but there are, it does depend on the national military culture, whether, say, in live training, how much risk do you really want live bullets flying around? Some countries maybe have decided they're not going to get involved in conflicts, so tempo does affect, if you're not ever involved, then that's going to change things. And obviously, if you've got different equipment, that changes things. How deep your pockets are, and who your allies and enemies are. So all these things make it quite difficult to say, well, this is exactly how things are done. But I think our survey says, but I would say that this sort of captures the essence. So in basic training, I think across the world, this is, you want to get people faced up to the physical hardship. You want people to be able to work in teams, be able to march, have some basic skills like firing a rifle. And I think the one in the bottom right is, if you can see that, is building that camaraderie where people are going to be prepared to essentially risk their lives for their colleagues and so forth. So that building that camaraderie is incredibly important. And then moving on, whether they're soldier, airman or sailor, they will then move on to more specialist training, and as I'll come to later, that can range anywhere from your fast jet pilot to a ship's cook. So huge range of training, and maybe in different environments, Arctic or desert, etc. So this is where you've gone from basic and now you're building your expertise. And then the next stage is moving towards that more team training where you're working together. So I think the helicopters in the top left there, where you've got your pilot and co-pilot, or mortar team, or even you're in a band. So it's all about working together. And in fact, we were just talking before the lunch, the importance of communication. That's a ship's bridge on the bottom left. So do people know what every other job is, and do they know how to talk to people? Are they willing to maybe raise their hand if something's wrong? There's some recent examples of where that can go wrong. And then the next level is where those teams, they might work with other teams, and this is obviously, this is more, you're going to probably do this sort of training less often because it's quite difficult to synchronize, but obviously things like soldiers talking to pilots is incredibly important. Sometimes obviously you want the munitions to drop on the right area. So that's the next level. And then lastly, coalition training exercises where you're trying to build, most nations, even, the big ones, don't tend to operate alone. They nearly always work with other nations. So building that interoperability so that people talk, again, the same language, that they know where their equipment works together and where it doesn't, and to again build that camaraderie between nations. So that's the last kind of level, and that's done less often because again it's really difficult to build, to sequence those things. So what hopefully I've just communicated here is that if you look at military knowledge and skills, there's a huge depth, there's a breadth, and you have to be flexible, as we said. And I think a great example is a nuclear submarine, where you need people to be able to operate a nuclear reactor. You need, really important, you need the submarine cook, and you need people to operate, maybe the sonar, weapons, you need a captain, etc. So huge range of skills there. And I think it then gets to the point where, and I've sort of got to this point by asking military people, is how do the military achieve this level of training education? So I guess I would just say it's a cultural thing. No one ever questions the importance of training. They might question which training system you need, but no one will ever question. So they will understand it's fundamental to what they're doing. People are assessed by how well they do in training. So if you don't achieve one level of training, you don't get any further. As I've just said there. And of course, there's peer pressure. No one wants to let anyone down, so peer pressure is a big driver. And much of life is spent training exercises. So when you, obviously, hopefully you're not on operations. So if you're not on operations, you would tend to be training and exercising. And also, particularly when there is conflict, that lessons learnt are fed back pretty quickly. Certainly ones that affect doctrine, but it's still, in my experience, it still takes a long time for the procurement people to change the systems that you might need to change. So although lessons are fed back, sometimes things change more slowly than you might think. Okay, so now I just think this isn't old thinking, and it isn't it is old generation, but some of this is quite new thinking. So I just want to show this. It's also an excuse to show some videos, because we're now in the afternoon. So I think, and I'm not going to cover all of history, but if you do a bit of research, probably the oldest surviving military training is this one here. It then took about 140 years for the printing press to come along, and then that allowed these sorts of approaches to be distributed. So that was the key thing. It wasn't just you would have to have a pamphlet in a castle. When the printing press came along, you could then spread it across, even perhaps to your enemies. So the way technology was affecting training, we could be seen from all those years ago. I'm now going to go to World War I, and I would say that pilots were probably the first to be willing to use some of these training technologies, mainly because the risk of not doing it was so high. So in the First World War, 90% of pilots, the sort of research shows that 90% didn't die in combat. So they would be dying in training or malfunctions in systems. So doing your training in simulation. So this is a very short clip. Hopefully it's work. And some sound. There's no sound. That's it. So that was just a very short clip. Obviously, they didn't have the video media on YouTube around in those days, so that was 100 years ago. And that was teaching, in fact, it was a British simulator. But I found this, which it just shows us nothing new in the world. So this is a report from the First World War air gunnery training, and it says that academic instruction is not enough. The learner must have ample practice. Giving brief lectures is really important. And I think down the bottom there it says that the instructors were actually giving the students not the up-to-date information, that there was a disconnect between the instruction and reality. So this idea that instructors need to be kept up with what's going on is incredibly important. So I think that you probably could say that about some modern training. So that's very interesting. The next video is showing kind of training on an industrial scale. These trainers were actually, the technology under them was from old automatic piano machines. So this kind of crossover of training and entertainment is not new. These linked trainers were training pilots in the Second World War, and they trained allegedly 500,000 pilots. So this was training on an industrial scale. And the other point about this is showing the importance of the instructors. So we'll show this.
Of science, he learns safely on the ground, the most difficult of all the pilot's tasks, to fly by instruments alone. In the blind link trainer, listening in his phones to the instructor's directions, he acquires the personal skill that will one day enable him to fly 600 miles over a darkened Europe.
You will now do a spin. Close the throttle. Move the control column fully back and apply full rudder.
Okay, I'm again sorry about the quality. They just didn't get it right in the Second World War. So yes, these made a huge impact in the Second World War, and you know, trained. In fact, they trained. These link trainers had already been sold to across the world, including Germany and Japan. So everyone used them. Okay, so on to the 70s. Sorry, this is showing kind of a progression in flight simulation. Who again are the early adopters mainly of, and I want to show this one because this idea of computerization comes along.
The famous Harrier jet vertical takeoff combat plane pilots learn how to fly it without leaving the ground. As in so many areas of modern life, the whole exercise is controlled by computer. The model landscape is true in every detail, and the television camera scanning it projects a picture in full color onto a monitor screen in the cockpit.
0 passing 2,000 feet this time, India Mark.
The pilot, it's as real as the real thing.
So this was extraordinary. There was no, although they were using computers, they weren't powerful enough to create visual computing. So actually the flight simulator was essentially a camera flying over that huge panorama that you saw. But I love that idea, this is as real as the real thing. So maybe, although this is, it looks very basic in our technology terms, it was as real as the real thing. But the reality was those simulators were pretty inflexible. You couldn't fly over any other land. That was just what was in there in that simulator. And it was incredibly expensive and high maintenance. And then the next video you'll see takes us into this century, and I was around when this video was being taken, where suddenly, and because those simulators were very expensive, they had lots of emotional attachment by the bureaucracy. And when these games came along, there were lots of people in the sort of bureaucratic military side, in procurement and research, who poo-pooed this. But I just want to show this next clip of, and they're using the Half-Life, the original Half-Life engine, for those who love computer games. Okay, so you get the, I mean, I was there and you just see these people that they weren't, it wasn't a computer game. They were really engaged. They were talking to each other. You know, you could tell that emotional connections between people and the emotional engagement of them wanting to actually go through a mission. We'll talk about VR later, but perhaps even that basic setup was really easy to say that. Anyway, I mentioned I work for Bohemia. This is again, I'm sorry about the quality, but this is from 10 years ago. This is my current CEO. I think he's a millennial, or close enough, and he's explaining in Australia in 2008, much better than I can do now, why computer games in training are useful in terms of simulation.
Tell us, what do you do here? We take computer games and modify them for serious use, be it the military or first responders like police and ambulance. We started several years ago now with a commercial computer game called Operation Flashpoint. That was sold in stores. I think it was Game of the Year in 2001, and we've added on layers of functionality to make it more suitable for military use. These layers of functionality include after-action review. So once the military users play through a scenario, they can watch what happened to work out if they did the right thing or the wrong thing. We added what's called HLA and disk compliance. This is the ability for VBS, or the computer game, to talk to other military simulations. We also added real-time editing functions. So the instructor in real time could do things like drop in an improvised explosive device, change the nature of the scenario without having to stop the scenario and then restart the scenario. It's a multiplayer game. You can have some infantry in there, so some soldiers. You can have some crew, maybe manning armoured vehicles like a tank or an armoured personnel carrier. You can have pilots flying aircraft, 50 or 100 soldiers sitting down, one at each computer, more or less playing together to achieve some training outcome. So the soldiers still need to go out into the field and shoot their rifles, for example. But what we offer is a way to supplement their training, train them up in doing the correct procedures, so when it becomes that stressful situation in the field or actually in theatre, maybe they're going to react a little bit quicker than what they would have without that simulated training. Simulated training at the moment, it's not as realistic as real life, but we're working on it.
So that was 10 years ago. And certainly we found, and this, it's not rich in academic studies, this area, because people don't like to do studies on real people. But certainly the studies that have been done show that games and simulation were very powerful to put the sort of going over and over things in your head. So when you actually had to do it in the real world, you didn't really have to think about it. And ideas of team training as well. This is what we found games were really powerful for, or simulation. And if you look at games-based simulation now, it's come a long way. So you can do not just your pilot now, whether it's land, sea or air. You know, the software really can cover it all. And moving to whole world simulation systems as well. So the world has changed completely in terms of simulation. And so I'm afraid this is my CEO now. He's got a bit more grey hair. This is very recent. And you know, we've spoken a bit about VR. So it isn't just about the software. This is now trying to link the software with modern sort of technologies. So here we go.
So what you're seeing here today is an Oculus Rift with a Leap motion sensor connected to obviously a desktop PC for rendering the VBS Blue environment. Also connected to Flex Air, which is a constructive simulation that also acts as a simulation host. Now the reason we're doing this is the idea that a pilot could sit with some low-cost hardware and actually control various parts of the cockpit using gestures by pointing at switches and toggling them in the VR space. Let's just fly down now over the city.